I'm Emily Eisner. I'm the chief economist at the Fiscal Policy Institute. My colleagues who will be presenting today include Michael Kinnucan, who's a senior health policy analyst, and Andrew Perry, who's the director of fiscal studies at the Fiscal Policy Institute. We also have the director of communications on, Kieran Finlayson, who I believe I forgot to introduce in the past. So welcome, Kieran, and thank you for handling all of the Zoom logistics and helping everyone make sure that they can hear and see and everything and ask their questions. I'll say one more time that we are recording this, and we will share the recording and the slides after the call, probably in the next day or two. We'll email you when it's available. Okay, and without further ado, let's get started. Next slide, Kieran. Thank you. Okay, so the agenda today is I'll introduce sort of how we're thinking about the political and economic landscape that this budget is being introduced into. Then Andrew will talk to us about New York's fiscal standing, so the state of New York's budget and revenue. He'll also talk about the steps that are being made towards achieving universal childcare in the state. Then Michael will talk about healthcare, which is one of the biggest spending areas in the state and an area that is of particular concern to us. Then I will talk about other affordability policy, specifically housing policy and food security. And then we'll have ample time for questions. We have a lot of content, so we're going to try to move fairly quickly. And if things are unclear, we will have time to clarify them at the end. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is probably a review. Many of you are keeping up with the politics and economics, but I guess it's obvious to say that 2025 has been a pretty wild ride for the whole country, the whole world, and New York. Next slide. The headlines and how we're thinking about this budget overall is that, number one, New York's fiscal base remains very strong despite all the economic uncertainty. We see really strong revenue, and Andrew will talk more about that. However, there's extreme inequality in the state, which means that the revenue is strong because top earners are doing well and paying taxes, but that strong revenue masks a certain amount of economic instability for working class, middle class, and lower income people in the state. Second, because of the election of Mayor Zoran Mamdani, there's a historic opportunity to fund and establish free universal childcare in New York, in the whole state and in the city. And that is being met with positive support from the governor. So they're taking really important steps towards establishing universal childcare. But again, as Andrew will describe, we still have a long way to go to really fully meet universality for kids of all ages under 5. And then finally, and equally important, the governor's budget is, we assess, to fail to fully meet the severity of the federal cuts coming to us, primarily through H.R. 1 or the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. We assess that those cuts might leave 1 million New Yorkers without health insurance and 350,000 New Yorkers without SNAP benefits that they rely on. And we believe that New York could be doing a much better job to preserve services for those folks. Next slide. I will go over this very quickly. I think that we all know that there's been a very erratic and draconian federal policy establishment over the last year that's causing major cuts to New York's essential services, primarily Medicaid, the Essential Plan, and SNAP. There's also have been illegal efforts to halt funding to programs like WIC, mental health care, and these have been challenged in court. But we expect to continue to see efforts like that being made to undercut New York services. Next slide. One thing to keep in mind is that those cuts can definitely be seen in the state's assessment of the budget. I'll draw your attention to the middle sort of set of bars of this chart. This is like the state's updated view of how much federal support we're getting. And you can see that for 2026, there was no real change, but starting in 2027, 2028, and 2029, the state estimates over $5 billion or close to $7 billion in reduced federal aid, and then it becomes over $10 billion in fiscal years 2028 and 2029. We think that this is actually an underestimate of the overall impact because the state isn't actually dealing with the fact that a million people might lose health insurance and about 350,000 might lose SNAP benefits. So these estimates of reduced federal aid are not actually fully accounting for service reductions that the state should be concerned about. Next slide. On the more positive side, the partnership with New York City's new mayor, Zohran Mamdani, has opened up opportunity for the state and city to fund full universal childcare and a set of other proposals as well. Governor Hochul is partnering with Mayor Mamdani to attempt to achieve universal childcare, and so that's a really big opportunity and a chance for some real improvements in the state services. Next slide. On the economic front, we see a real flatlining of employment. I have in red, or in blue is New York City employment, and in red is the rest of the state. And you can see that we have basically recovered from the pandemic, but now are not seeing growth in employment. This mirrors what's going on with the rest of the country, but it's a bad sign for the economy overall. Next slide. Nonetheless, personal income continues to grow. So even though employment is flatlining, total earnings in the state, total personal income has been growing since the pandemic and hasn't slowed down. Partly this is like offset by inflation. So this is nominal earnings on this slide. If we did it as real earnings, it would be a little bit shallower, but it has continued to grow. And that's part of why we're seeing revenues still be strong. Now, if we were to break it down between the high earners and sort of more moderate and low income people, this would show that there's a deep amount of inequality in the state. Next slide. And while I don't have that slide totally showing that inequality right now, what we do see is that New York's revenue is increasingly coming from high earners, partly because we raised their tax rates and partly because they're actually earning more and they've had more earnings growth over the last few years. Next slide. Lastly, on economic landscape, New York continues to experience a cost of living crisis. This is inflation over the last 5 years or so, I guess 6 years. So we see that there was a major spike in 2021 and 2022, but we really haven't gotten back to that 2% target rate. And in fact, New York City and the Northeast in general has higher inflation rates than the rest of the country. And so we're really still battling with a deep cost of living crisis and sort of an acute inflation situation. Okay, the bottom line on all of this is that we're in a strong fiscal position, but the state needs to do more to address the cost of living and federal cuts. And I will let my colleague Andrew take it away from here. You're muted, Andrew.
Right. Thank you, Emily. So I'm going to talk about the state's just fiscal condition heading into fiscal year 2027. So the bottom line on the state's fiscal condition is that we're on very solid ground at the present with about $12 billion in surpluses through fiscal year 2027. These surpluses, as we'll see, are driven by strong revenue. And those surpluses really support the new spending priorities that we're going to talk about for fiscal year 2027, including childcare. So despite this strength in the present moment, the state retains its pessimistic outlook for revenue in the future. And that leads to sort of projected gaps that are modest but present in the future years. And at the same time, fiscal reserves remain at record high levels. Next slide. So the division of budget says that the collective surplus for the current fiscal year, 2026, and the one that's upcoming, 2027, is $5.9 billion. This substantially understates the actual surplus for two big reasons. One is that the state also has a $2 billion prepayment to its debt service. So that offsets our future debt service costs by plowing some surplus to prepaying debt. That doesn't count in DOB's official surplus. And then second big reason is something called the transaction risk reserve. And the transaction risk reserve is this sort of fiscal maneuver that the state does every year where they subtract $2 billion from the apparent general fund resources. And they use this as a sort of in-year buffer, which the state says is a buffer against any sort of unexpected drop in revenue or increase in spending. It means that they have $2 billion that are not baked into the plan that they can deploy. The reality is that the transaction risk reserve is never used, and at the close of every year, that those $2 billion are returned to the general fund. So it's as if they're sort of hiding $2 billion of general fund resources in each year. And that does not factor into the surplus. So when we adjust for these factors, we find that there's actually about a $12 billion fiscal surplus for the current and upcoming fiscal years. Next slide. Where did these surpluses come from? The answer is really solid revenue growth. So the fiscal year 2026 enacted budget had an extremely pessimistic revenue outlook. It's important to note that that plan, the 26 enacted plan, was published in April of 2025. So this was a moment of extreme economic uncertainty, and the state played it really cautious by projecting basically no revenue growth for the next 3 years. What that would mean in economic terms is that that's something you would only see in like a very profound recession. It would be worse than essentially the the Great Recession in 2008 if revenue was perfectly flat for 3 years. So they had extremely pessimistic revenue projections. Those did not come true. In fiscal year 2026, the current year, revenue exceeded those projections by $7 billion, and DOB is projecting that fiscal year 2027 revenue will exceed those projections by $8 billion. So revenue really lifted those pessimistic projections up, and that's what accounts for these surpluses. It's also worth noting that the state is taking two sort of substantial revenue actions that are going to lift revenue in the future. The first is canceling a planned cut in the corporate tax rate. So the corporate tax rate was planned to be cut in 2027. The executive budget proposes canceling that cut and keeping the corporate tax rate constant from its current level. And second, the state proposes decoupling from provisions of the OBBBA that would have reduced the corporate tax revenue. So the OBBA has all of these preferential treatments for corporate tax that would have affected corporations' New York state tax liability, and we are decoupling from those provisions. So again, that's just keeping the sort of tax treatment of corporations in New York constant from its current level and not giving them a tax cut. And those actions are going to bring in $1.5 to $2 billion in the future years. And the last thing that's worth noting about sort of the DOB's revenue projections is that they tend to have relatively flat revenue projections. So we can see this purple bar is the 2026 enacted budget projections. And I mentioned how it's strange that it's perfectly flat for 3 years, because that's really not something that we see much in the real world outside of sort of disastrous recessions. The updated projections do lift revenue for each year, and it adds a little bit of growth into the trend, but that growth rate is still extremely subdued. It's still a pretty low growth rate that's much lower than what we normally see in any kind of normal economic times. So even though they have revenue growing, and the updated revenue projections are those numbers that are in the call-out boxes at the top of the bars, even though those are growing, they're actually growing at less than the rate of inflation. So the Division of Budget is saying that they think revenue is going to grow below the rate of inflation for the next 3 years. And again, that's very unusual outside of a significant recession. So even though they've lifted the overall level of revenue projections, we can still say that this is extremely a pessimistic outlook. Next slide. That pessimistic outlook leads them into their gaps. The Division of Budget is projecting an average $9 billion gap for each of the 3 out years. That's largely because revenue projections are so pessimistic. If revenue grows at even a subdued rate, and what I call a subdued rate is half of the historical average growth rate adjusting for inflation. So it's a pretty sort of slow rate of revenue growth. But even that slow rate of revenue growth would narrow those gaps substantially, and it would lead to gaps of about $3 billion per year. That still doesn't account for the transaction risk reserve. And the transaction risk reserve becomes even more important in the future because DOB wants to raise it from $2 billion per year to $3 billion per year. So it would remove $3 billion in sort of apparent fiscal resources in each of the out years. If we adjust for that, we can predict that actual surpluses will be something like $1 billion in each of the out year on average. Next slide. All of this has held reserves at their record levels. Reserves have been at about $30 billion per year since 2024, and they're still at that level. It's important to underscore that DOB regularly claims that we reduced the reserves by about $8 billion to pay off the unemployment insurance trust debt this year. And that's really misleading because while they did use some deployed reserves to pay off that debt, they also added $8 billion to a separate reserve fund that's legally and practically identical to the existing reserve funds, but it has a different name, and DOB chooses not to sort of designate this as its official reserves. And so they can claim that reserves are lower. It's really not the count. If we do a proper full accounting of general fund balances that are uncommitted and available to support the budget, we see that reserves have been pretty resilient at about $30 billion. Okay, next slide. With that, I'm going to start talking about childcare. So the budget takes a really historic and major step towards universal childcare with a set of programs. By fiscal year 2028, these programs will reach $2.7 billion in spending and probably support something on the order of 100,000 seats, free universal seats for children under 5. This is a major step towards universal childcare. However, full universal childcare is probably going to cost something on the order of $5 billion beyond that level and support 250,000 seats. It's further worth noting that living wages for childcare workers are not part of the governor's proposal. They are part of our estimate, our $5 billion estimate. Next slide. Okay, this table is a lot to take in, but I think it's worth walking through the major components of the governor's proposal and what a universal system would look like. So right now, children under 3 are really only supported by income-tested vouchers called the Childcare Assistance Program. In New York City, they might get 3K. In much of the state, they would get pre-K when they turn 4. And everybody gets universal kindergarten in the year they turn 5. The governor's proposal has some major expansions to this. They are adding money to the means-tested vouchers. They're launching Childcare for 2-year-olds in New York City, bolstering the city's 3K system, and taking pre-K to be fully statewide rather than mostly statewide and making that truly universal. So this is major progress. It's not fully universal yet. What a universal system would look like would be to take, and here we have sort of where there's sort of completed progress is in green, where there's still work to be done is in yellow, and where there's really no work being done is in red. So what we would need to do is expand Childcare and 3K to be truly statewide, and then build on that to make a real universal system, likely modeled on the Childcare for children under 2, and take that statewide, and that would be that extra $5 billion. Next slide. Okay. So what's in the governor's actual plan? I mentioned that the plan will eventually rise to be about $2.7 billion by fiscal year 2029, but in fiscal year 2027, they're spending $1.7 billion. This to cover about 100,000 seats. I already mentioned 2K and 3K in New York City, uh, pre-K for 4-year-olds statewide, expanding vouchers, and it's worth noting that those vouchers can support children up to 13. So they don't, all of those vouchers aren't all going to children under 5, and that's the group we're really talking about when we talk about universal childcare. And no increases in wages for childcare workers. And we're going to take each of these elements one by one. Next slide. So 2Care in New York City. The fiscal year 2027 budget appropriates $73 million to launch the program, and they expect that to support about 2,000 seats. In subsequent years, that appropriation will rise to roughly $650 million and support 30,000 seats, according to the state's estimates. And our math says that that assumes about a 50% uptake rate, which we think is reasonable, especially when you consider that many 2-year-olds will also be supported by the expanded CCAP vouchers. Next slide. So what's the plan for preschoolers? The executive budget proposes taking universal pre-kindergarten for 4-year-olds truly statewide. That's going to be about 40,000 seats. It will cost $561 million in fiscal year 2027. And that's going to happen by increasing the per pupil funding amount to $10,000 or the foundation aid amount, whichever is greater, which is a substantial increase in funding for districts across the state, including New York City, high need districts, and high value districts, which tend to have pretty low grant levels under the existing UPK grant program. New York City is set to receive $235 million, which will allow it to bolster its 3K system, and the rest of the state will receive $326 million, which will bolster existing UPK pre-K programs and expand it to new districts that don't currently have pre-K. And that's when we're really going to get to universal pre-K, is by reaching those districts that don't yet offer the program. Next slide. And the final piece of the plan is CCAP, the CCAP vouchers. The budget appropriates an additional $1.2 billion to clear the existing wait lists on the program and support sort of growth in the program. The program has continued to grow at a pretty brisk rate following increases to eligibility that have been enacted in recent years. Again, as I mentioned, these vouchers can support children up to the age of 13. So when we estimate how many of these vouchers will reach children under 5, we estimate that that's about 50,000 additional vouchers for that group. So where's the money coming from? Next slide. Notably, the budget proposes no new revenue. UPK, importantly, is a recurring commitment tied to the level of need, and it's legislatively changed, right? The budget actually proposes legislation that will commit the state to spending additional money tied to the need. So it's obligated, recurring funding tied to need. So that's really the gold standard for state funding for universal programming. That's how schools are funded. CCAP is a recurring commitment in the plan, but it's an annual appropriation. So the state isn't obligated to spend that money in the future. So even though they say that they'll spend another $1.2 billion in fiscal year 2028, there's no law that says they have to do that. And so that's going to be an appropriation that will come up for a fight every year. And 2Care is really in the same boat. It is recurring in the financial plan. The governor made some statements that made it unclear if it would be, and we can confirm that there is recurring 2Care spending in the financial plan, but it's not legislatively obligated or tied to need. What that means is that there's no state law that says the state has to spend 2Care, and that their appropriation for 2Care doesn't have to grow as program costs grow. So what that means is that this is a major victory for now. It doesn't avoid the potential sort of fights for 2Care funding down the road, though. Really, only a UPK style state law obligating funding could do that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael to talk about healthcare.
Thank you, Andrew. Hi, my name is Michael Kinnucan. I'm the Health Policy Director at the Fiscal Policy Institute. And I'm going to give a bit of a whirlwind tour of what the executive budget does on healthcare. This will move really, really quickly, but we will send out the slides afterward if you miss something. Next slide. So the big picture thing to focus on is what the executive budget does not propose to do on healthcare. As most of the people on this call now know, there have been really significant federal cuts to New York's healthcare system. Those cuts are projected, or FPI is projecting that they'll cause about 1 million New Yorkers to lose health insurance over the next 2 years, which would double our uninsurance rate. New York does have the resources and sort of policy capacity to prevent that kind of insurance loss, but unfortunately, the executive budget doesn't propose to do it. Instead, the executive budget focuses on protecting providers to some degree from these insurance losses, but does not actually propose new initiatives to keep people covered. So that's the big picture. But first, let's talk about what the Medicaid program is doing now. Next slide. So New York's Medicaid program, in the status quo, the federal cuts haven't started to bite yet. So none of this is being driven by federal cuts, but just in the status quo because of internal program dynamics, New York State's Medicaid enrollment is actually shrinking. The headline enrollment is down. Mainstream managed care, which is sort of the biggest Medicaid program, is down. And managed long-term care, which has been growing at rates around 9 or 10% for the past several years, that growth has really cratered to 2.2%. For some of those reasons, Department of Health Medicaid spending is actually $700 million below where it was projected to be in the fiscal year 26 enacted budget. So I think we've all heard this sort of narrative of spiraling Medicaid costs so frequently that I just want to sort of set the baseline. New York's Medicaid program right now has modest growth, or it's shrinking in terms of enrollment. Next slide. So this shows some of the shrinking dynamics by program. Next slide. And sort of that controlled spending on existing programs plus significant federal cuts leads to a projection that actually New York State's total Medicaid and essential plan spending, state and federal funds, which is what this table from the financial plan shows, is actually projected to shrink by $4 billion from this current fiscal year to fiscal year 27 and to continue to shrink into fiscal year 2028. These changes mostly reflect cuts to the essential plan funding from the federal government, and they don't incorporate, the executive budget does not incorporate at all the impact of Medicaid work requirements, which are projected to kick a further 750,000 people off the program. So we're actually expecting quite dramatic essential plan and Medicaid fiscal shrinkage over the next 2 to 3 years. Next slide. Oddly, though, the executive budget does not present the situation this way. Instead, it says that, due to spiraling enrollment and so forth, MLTC, that DOH Medicaid is expected to grow by 11.5% next year. So that's quite confusing to have a shrinking program that is projected to continue to shrink and then have this subpart of it, state-funded DOH Medicaid, grow so much. So we're going to explain that mystery. Next slide. So that growth in state DOH Medicaid is largely due to changes to the essential plan. So the essential plan is being cut due to federal changes. It's losing about half of its federal funding. The state has proposed a plan to preserve essential plan coverage for people up to 200% of the federal poverty line. 460,000 enrollees above that sort of cutoff would lose essential plan coverage under the state's sort of current proposal. The executive budget assumes that this proposal, which requires federal approval, will not be implemented. And so if the state's current plan is not implemented, then cuts will happen in a more dramatic way, and about 500,000 people will move from the essential plan to state-funded Medicaid. That will drive about $2 billion in extra expected funding in fiscal year 2026. Now, that drives more than half of the projected Medicaid increase, is moving that brand new population of 500,000 current essential plan enrollees to state-funded Medicaid. But that scenario is actually not the most likely scenario. What's likely to happen is that we do get federal approval for our new essential plan, and these 500,000 people stay on the essential plan, in which case the state will spend $2 billion less on Medicaid than the executive budget projects. That's a really important point to keep in mind, because it may mean that we find out we have $2 billion extra dollars in Medicaid, and we can find ways to spend those to preserve coverage. Next slide. So adjusting for essential plan, the state DOH Medicaid growth is expected to be just 5.6%. Even so, that's still sort of higher than you would think given shrinking enrollment. Next slide. Most of that increase is due to what the executive budget calls $750 million in targeted healthcare investments. It's not super clear what these are, but as far as we can tell, what the state is doing is replacing lost federal MCO tax revenue for provider rate increases out of state funds. And so that's driving a lot of growth. Next slide. This fits a pattern. There have been significant provider rate increases, excluding Medicare and just focusing on doctors, hospitals, nursing homes, especially hospitals. We've seen about $4 billion in cumulative provider rate increases over the past 5 years. So that's important to keep in mind as we think about Medicaid growth. Next slide. The executive is asserting really significant savings from its CDPAP transition. It's claiming $1.2 billion in state share savings out of that program, which would be a really massive savings. Some of that is from lower administrative costs. It's unclear what the rest is. I think there's a real question about whether these savings will be realized because many people in this population are actually switching to agency. Next slide. The executive is likely counting savings from consumers who transition to agency, and/or it's counting the sort of the fall off in enrollment in MLTC due to the CDPAP transition as part of these savings, but it's not clear for various reasons I'll be publishing about shortly whether these savings will actually be sustained. So there's a question mark there. Next slide. The executive budget, in addition to the rate increases we discussed, it spends $300 million more on the safety net transformation program and operating support. This is a great program that can help safety net hospitals sort of reorganize themselves and stay in business. However, the executive budget proposes a $500 million cut to another safety net program for hospitals, the Vital Access Provider Assistance Program. That's set to go down from $750 million to $250 million. This has been proposed every year for several years and rejected by the legislature, but we'll see if this is the year. Next slide. But the big picture here is if this budget goes into effect sort of as planned, we're going to see over 1 million New Yorkers lose health insurance due to cuts to Medicaid and the essential plan. The deadlines on that are tight. People will start losing coverage due to essential plan changes in July, and they will start losing Medicaid coverage due to work requirements in January. The legislature should prioritize keeping those people covered and emphasize that over sort of the related goal of maintaining provider rate increases, because keeping people covered will support providers, support safety net hospitals as well as the people involved, right? It's a very fiscally efficient, smart thing to do. It's also the humane thing to do. And we have an opportunity to do that not only because the state is in robust fiscal health, as Emily and Andrew discussed, but also because if we do get this essential plan approval from the federal government, then within the executive budget, we will have $2 billion more in resources to support providing alternative sources of insurance for the million New Yorkers who are about to lose it, which is something we should think about, that contingency, and think about how to use that money to sustain our healthcare system. Thank you. And I'll pass it back to Emily.
Awesome. Okay, so we're nearing the end of our presentation, just to give you that sense of time, and we'll open up to questions in a minute. But I first want to talk about, very quickly, two other very important policy areas. So food security and housing. I touched on these earlier, but let's talk about them in depth. So I mentioned there were pretty severe federal cuts to SNAP, including more restrictive work requirements that may result in about 350,000 New Yorkers losing their benefits. The governor, I believe for the first time, really acknowledged food security as one of her policy areas. I mean, we had free school meals in previous budgets, but I guess more broadly, food security was included in the state of the state and in her address. But they fall short of really maintaining full services. There's a small amount of money given to food banks. There are important improvements to the EBT card so that we reduce the amount of theft that can happen in people's SNAP benefit. There were not allocated any funds to support SNAP administration, which is one of the federal cuts that was made. A few $100 million will be needed to maintain the level of funding in SNAP administration in the state. There are some improvements to summer meals, et cetera. But importantly, because work requirements are playing such a big role in making people drop off of both SNAP eligibility and Medicaid eligibility, the state needs to put significant effort into increasing and helping people meet those work requirements, both through increasing funding for administration so that people have support to do the paperwork that is necessary to prove that they meet the work requirements. Sometimes it's helping people who have disabilities fill out the appropriate paperwork to say, yes, I have a disability, and thus I am not subject to the work requirement. So lowering the barrier to help people actually, correctly say that they have a disability is important. And then there are ways that the state can also help people find work and find volunteer opportunities, which would then make them eligible for SNAP. And then we could leverage more federal dollars. On top of these options to try to leverage more federal dollars, there is need in the long term for the state to create a state-funded SNAP supplement. And that will become even more important over the next few years because of the way that HR 1 sort of does cost shifting from the federal government to states. But we'd like to start talking about it now to make sure that it gets done. Next slide. On housing policy, so the last few years, we all know that housing affordability is perhaps like the core affordability problem that we're all facing in the whole country and in New York for sure. So the proposed rent freeze in New York City is one important answer to the affordability issues, and it's sparked a lot of conversation, a lot of opportunity, and some debate. One opportunity and sort of improvement that's being made are improvements to the SCREE and DREE programs, which are New York City programs that support seniors and people with disabilities by giving them a rent freeze. But so we're increasing the income limit that makes people eligible for those programs. Then on the flip side, there's a lot of overblown concern about the financial and physical sustainability of rent stabilized buildings, and that's driving some policy proposals, and that are some which might have benefits like the J51 tax abatement, which will help some buildings that are in need of rehabilitation actually get those rehabilitations done. But it's also opening a door for opposition groups to weaken the renter protections that have been won over the last few years. The governor also proposes some very modest investments in affordable housing development. I would just emphasize that they're not enough. There's some investment in climatization of homes and some infrastructure to implement climate change adaptation. Those are good, but a lot more needs to be done. There's some vague first steps towards bringing down home insurance costs. That's something that we will be talking about more over the budget cycle, but the governor doesn't propose any concrete steps on that. And then at the Fiscal Policy Institute, we'd like to see the state and the city come together to create a much more robust plan to fund NYCHA capital needs than we're seeing. And the governor has not proposed any plan to support NYCHA's capital needs in her budget proposal. And there's also no additional funds for the Housing Access Voucher Program, which got off the ground last year. Next slide. So this is concluding our presentation. Just to review a little bit, the state is in a very strong fiscal position, despite the fact that the economy is super weird and not necessarily in the greatest position. We're in a strong position because incomes of high earners have remained strong, and we are taxing them progressively, which we can do more of. The state, because of this strong fiscal position, can do more to address the cost of living, particularly housing and food security, and certainly must do more to backfill service cuts driven by HR 1 and federal policy cuts. If the state doesn't do more, we're looking at about 1 million New Yorkers losing health insurance, 350,000 New Yorkers losing food stamps or SNAP benefits. And then finally, we have this historic opportunity politically to achieve universal childcare in the state. The governor has put forward material, important first steps, but the job isn't done. And so we would advocate for completing that. I think that's it. Kieran, can you put up the... Yeah, so before we jump into answering your questions, I'll just note that our next briefing is online, virtual, like today. It's on February 19th at noon. We will send out emails about it, but this QR code also leads you to the page to sign up for that. And we will also keep in touch with you about when we'll be in person in Albany, which will also be in February. So without further ado, let's go to answering your questions. Michael and Andrew, I would prefer, sorry, I see some people putting hands up. If it's possible to put your question in writing in the Q&A chat, that is actually easier for us to monitor. So if you don't know how to do that, I can explain it, but yeah, try to do that. Michael or Andrew, do you want to just jump in?
There are a lot of great questions in here. I think we should just start at the top. So, Andrew, someone is asking, do you think the executive's office is overestimating sales tax revenue projections? And then someone else is asking, does the universal child care include children with disabilities?
Sure. So on sales tax, I pulled up the sales tax projections for the next couple of years, and they look like they're only a touch above the rate of inflation. So to me, that seems modest. So I would say, no, I don't see that. Children with disabilities and childcare. Yeah, this is an important issue. Currently, the CDPAP vouchers have a rate increase for providers who care for children with disabilities. There are concerns, in the advocacy community that doesn't go far enough, and children with disabilities are inadequately supported by these programs. The executive budget proposals really don't touch on this, so they retain the status quo where there is additional funding for children with disabilities, but you know, many consider it inadequate. Um, I can keep going because I see it's like I think they're in order, so it's like of when they're asked, so it's all childcare in the front. Um, does FPI cost estimate include making universal childcare full day and full year? Really important question. Um, we include a sort of year-round for children up to 3, based on sort of existing rates that we mark up for to have a living wage. And then we do rely on 3K and pre-K in our model, which is not full year and full day. In New York City, the city has local programs that really get you to full after school um, coverage. And so it's a fair point that is a concern outside of New York City and the rest of the state for 3-year-olds. Parents would have to pay. The current situation is that parents just sort of pay out of pocket um, for the to get from like 2:40 to the end of the workday. So that's a fair point. Childcare wage estimates. I don't know exactly what the question is, but right now the governor's proposal really doesn't deal with childcare wages. Most people consider them inadequate. The median wage for childcare worker is about $39,000. So that's not included in the costs of the executive proposals. When we calculate the cost of universal childcare, I include marking it up to a living wage. Um, how does the additional funding for pre-K in New York City bolster the program? So right now, most people consider the pre-K for 4-year-olds in New York City a pretty robust program where there's wide availability. 3K is newer and it's really not been funded properly. So while the former mayor, Eric Adams, would argue that they were offering everybody a seat in 3K who applied, some of those seats really weren't good enough to take, right? Like it could be a couple miles away, which in New York City might be an hour away. So the offers weren't good enough to provide, like a kindergarten. You're entitled to go to a kindergarten that's near your home. And that's not how the 3K system works. So with some additional funding, we should be able to bring more seats online and provide better seats to people in the places that they actually live. What amount of 2Care funding is recurring? Does it cover the 30,000 people? This is a really good question, and I'm trying to get more detailed answers from the state because what's in the financial plan is fairly opaque. My best estimate is that something on the order of $650 million is recurring in the financial plan. And my estimates are that without doing any work around wages, that should be about how much it costs to get to 30,000 kids by fiscal year 2029. Yeah. And it looks like now we're getting some health questions. So why don't I stop talking and give someone else a chance to talk?
Yeah. Let me swing through some of these. Um, Steve Auerbach asks the great question, why do we think that the Trump administration will approve the state's planned essential plan changes? I think we have a really strong entitlement in this case. We're asking to access reserves that are due to New York State. Obviously, nothing is certain, and the issue could result in litigation. But from my inexpert perspective, we have a really strong case and are liable to get a good chance to get essential plan approval. Belkis asks how much is projected to be saved from the elimination of Medicaid continuous coverage for children aged 0 to 6. New York State, a year or two ago, implemented this really wonderful policy where in children aged 0 to 6, if they're enrolled in Medicaid at any point, they are presumed to just sort of stay eligible until they turn 6, without the need for sort of paperwork and so forth. The federal cuts banned that. It's now being eliminated. And so that means some children will get kicked off of Medicaid because their parents didn't send in the right forms or whatever. The executive budget doesn't project savings for that. I suspect it'll be totally trivial and insignificant because it's very, very cheap to provide Medicaid to children. And so that, this is just an example of how federal policy is hurting our health. Steve Auerbach points out that there are savings opportunities from getting managed care out of our long-term care system, which I very strongly agree with, and will definitely be covering as we cover the budget. Brian O'Malley points out and sort of asks, like, it seems like what with sort of the CDPAP transition lowering home care spending and significant provider rate increases, that maybe the New York Medicaid program is on balance, sort of shifting resources from institutional care, like from home care rather, to institutional models of care, like hospitals and nursing homes. We haven't analyzed that, but it is certainly something to track. Someone points out that I didn't say anything about mental health. There's a lot about mental health in the executive budget, but we can only cover so much in 10 minutes. Definitely keep an eye out as the budget season goes on for more on that. Andrea Smith points out that work requirements were tied to the federal minimum wage for Medicaid. So you have to work 80 hours, but really what that means is you have to have 80 times $7.25 times the federal minimum wage worth of earned income in order to in a month in order to meet the Medicaid work requirement. That's a really important detail. I know the New York State Department of Health is working really hard to sort of implement these work requirements in a way that minimizes coverage loss. And there may be creative opportunities there. Like, for me, I'm tempted to ask, what if the state, paid people like 80 times $7.25 to complete an online survey or something? Would that help them meet the work requirements? Because I really think this is a bad policy, and anything we can do to mitigate it would be great. But there hasn't been specific discussion about that. And unfortunately, the federal implementing regulations on the work requirements are not out yet and won't be out until next summer. So there are many, many unknowns on that score. And if the state's essential plan does not receive federal approval, someone asks, and we do need to use that $2 billion to cover some of the essential plan population on Medicaid, how many people are going to lose coverage? The answer is more. Like, that will be a worse situation with potentially coverage losses exceeding 1 million and going up to 1.2, 1.3. It's a concerning situation. That said, I'll just say, providing state-funded health insurance is a cheap and fiscally sensible policy to pursue. And I think that's mostly it for Medicaid. So I'll kick it to Emily.
Yeah, I think there's a question about whether NYCHA has been sold. I think that's reacting to me saying that there's not a funding plan for the capital improvements that need to be made in NYCHA. And NYCHA has not been sold. It is still public housing under, the city owns, and it in partnership with the federal government how NYCHA gets funded. But because NYCHA is in need of a lot of money for capital repairs, FPI is advocating that the state should also chip in to support those repairs. I don't know the answer to the Sustainable Futures Fund. If you follow up with me, I can get back to you about that. Someone asked about the Sustainable Futures Fund, Jeff Jones. So feel free to email me and I can follow up on that. Andrew, why don't you take the question that's about, is there any funding in the state budget to address the New York City $12 billion budget gap?
No. There's money in the state budget for New York City for 3K, for the childcare block grant. Those are the really big pieces of money coming to the city. Overall, the state estimates that its actions in this budget will give New York City a total of $1.6 billion above the baseline status quo. So on net, in the context of sort of normal fiscal analysis, you would consider this a good budget for the city. Having said that, there's no sort of extraordinary spending above the things I mentioned that would address the city's projected deficit.
That ties in a little bit with it. So Zara asked if our next briefing is on the state budget. Are we going to say anything on New York City? We do need to say something on New York City. Our next briefing will still be on the state budget because the New York City budget relies on the state budget. We've been putting our effort currently into the state budget, knowing that they are sort of inextricably linked. But yes, we will work on putting something together that's specifically on the New York City budget. Andrew, do you want to add anything on that?
No.
Alex Hemmerstein is asking, we have not today talked about SUNY and higher education. There is funding for SUNY and CUNY in the budget. Andrew, do you remember the...
It's a good question that ties into what our next briefing is that you've been mentioning. So this is our sort of first look at the very highest level lines of what happened with the state's fiscal balance and what are the top areas, after reviewing these materials for a day. The analysis, the briefing we're doing on February 19th is also on the state budget. It's more detailed. It's going to be it's going to be a comprehensive overview of everything that's in the executive budget, and it's going to put FPI's policy priorities forward. And so we're going to talk about SUNY budget, the SUNY spending there. It's not the top. It's not a top issue because it's largely a status quo budget for the public higher education, I would argue.
I'm going to jump in and say it's 1 p.m. I know there's a lot more questions in the chat. If you want to follow up with us about those, please feel free to shoot us an email, and we can do that. But I think we've answered a lot of the questions so far. So we're going to close the Zoom. We will let you know when the video and slides have been posted online. And yeah, please come to our next briefing where we will sort of go into depth in some of the details that we haven't been able to cover today. Thanks, everyone.